Have you ever actually stopped to think about who really runs this planet? We tend to think it's us, right? Humans, with our massive cities and global reach. But honestly, the truth is, the most powerful forces on Earth are entirely invisible to the naked eye. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to embark on a journey from the macroscopic anomalies we can clearly see, all the way down to the very DNA of the microbes that literally dictate human health, our food supply, and our entire environment. We are exploring the absolutely fascinating hidden universe of microbiology. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll be defining the microbial world. Then we'll look at the pioneers of microbiology, followed by prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. After that, we'll explore viruses and acellular life, map out the branches of microbiology, and finally, end at the molecular frontier. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Defining the Microbial World, the study of small life. To really wrap our heads around the science, we kind of have to look at the word itself. The term microbiology was actually first coined by the famous French chemist Louis Pasteur. The word comes from Greek roots. You've got mikros meaning small, bio meaning life, and logos meaning discourse. So quite literally, it's the discourse or the study of small life. It's the science of living organisms, germs, or microbes that require a microscope for us to even see them. So the absolute crucial point here is that science is the defining characteristic. Well, almost always. Because, every rule in biology seems to have a fascinating exception, and here it is, mushrooms. They are macrofungi, obviously totally visible without a microscope. Yet, despite lacking those microscopic dimensions, organisms like these mushrooms and certain green algae like Spirogyra are strictly classified under the microbial world. Why? Well, they're studied by microbiologists because their fundamental structures, the way they reproduce, and their life cycles align perfectly with the strictly microscopic fungi and algae. It's pretty wild. Moving right along to Section 2, Pioneers of Microbiology, Seeing the Invisible. So people actually knew about the effects of microbes, things like diseases and fermented foods, since ancient times, but they obviously couldn't see the cause. The big conceptual leap happened way back in 1478 when the Roman philosopher Fracastoro first suggested that invisible creatures were causing diseases. Then, more than a century later, around 1625, Francesco Stellucci started using early lenses to study things like bees and weevils. But the true, absolute breakthrough? That came in 1676. A Dutch draper from Delft named Antony van Leeuwenhoek essentially became the father of microbiology. The funny thing is, he didn't even set out to be a scientist. He just developed incredibly good magnifying lenses for inspecting his textiles. And with those lenses, he was the very first to clearly observe and document the microbial world, basically pioneering an entirely new branch of science by accident. Now, let's zoom in a bit closer for Section 3, Prokaryotes versus Eukaryotes, the cellular divide. Once electron microscopes came onto the scene in the 19th century, scientists realized that all the cellular life is split by a massive, literal divide, basically categorized into two main groups. On one side, we have prokaryotes. That word literally means before nucleus. These guys are simple, primitive structures. They're mostly unicellular, meaning the whole organism is literally just one cell, and they feature 70S-type ribosomes. Now on the other side, we have eukaryotes, which means true nucleus. These are vastly more complex. They have a double membrane nucleus that securely houses their DNA, complex internal organelles, and while some are single-celled, most are macroscopic and multicellular. Things like plants, animals, and us. Let's look at the simple side first. Notice what's missing in the basic structure of a prokaryote, specifically a bacterium here. There's no distinct nucleus holding the genetics. Instead, their DNA just exists as a single, circular, double helix kind of floating around in the nucleoid region. They exhibit very little morphological differentiation inside. You'll also want to note the outer layer. Most prokaryotes have cell walls built from a structural molecule called peptidoglycan. Think of it acting like their own personal protective armor. Now, contrast that primitive setup with the eukaryotic cell, and this brilliantly illustrates the massive jump in complexity, doesn't it? Right in the center, you see that large purple true nucleus, which is double membrane bound, protecting the DNA that is neatly organized into chromosomes. Outside the nucleus, the cell is just packed with unit membrane-bound organelles, like mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, and the endoplasmic reticulum. It's essentially a highly organized, microscopic factory where absolutely every structure has a specific complex job. Which brings us to Section 4, Viruses and Acellular Life, the Boundary of Living Matter. Let's push past the cell itself. Beyond prokaryotes and eukaryotes, we find acellular biological entities. Acellular literally means completely devoid of cells. This category includes things like viruses, viroids, and satellites. They don't possess the structure of a cell at all. Instead, they're what we call obligate intracellular parasites. Basically, they can't reproduce on their own. They absolutely must invade a host cell and hijack its machinery to multiply. What makes them behave somewhat like living things is that they carry genetic material. But interestingly enough, they contain either DNA or RNA, never both in the same organism. So they're pathogenic strictly at the genetic level. But hey, just because they lack cells doesn't mean they lack variety. Take the HIV virus, featuring its distinct reverse transcriptase and lipid membrane. Contrast that with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the agent responsible for COVID-19, which is characterized by those really prominent spike glycoproteins. Both of these are entirely reliant on human host cells to survive and multiply, yet they utilize completely different architectures to invade our bodies. It's a real biological arms race. But hold on, viruses aren't even the absolute extreme of the invisible world. That title, that belongs to prions. Prions are infectious agents composed only of proteins. They entirely lack any genomes, DNA, or RNA, literally none. It's just a misfolded protein that somehow triggers other healthy proteins in the brain to misfold as well. They're responsible for devastating, untreatable, spongiform encephalopathies, which are diseases that literally put holes in the brain, like mad cow disease and Kuru. This really represents the absolute blurry boundary between living and non-living matter. All right, let's zoom back out a bit for Section 5, Branches of Microbiology, Organizing the Unseen. With all these different microbes running around, we have to organize this chaos into incredibly specialized branches. Notice how specific the focus of medical microbiology gets here? Bacteriology looks at both harmful and beneficial bacteria. Virology is dedicated solely to viruses. Then you have mycology, which is the study of fungi, both the pathogenic ones that cause disease in immunocompromised hosts and the environmental scavengers. Parasitology covers parasites like protozoa and helminths. And finally, immunology. This one studies the body's resistance to all these invaders, looking closely at antibodies, antigens, and of course, the absolutely critical development of vaccines. But microbiology isn't just about disease and medicine, right? It's deeply embedded in our everyday lives through applied microbiology. Look at the industrial branch. Without microbes, we literally wouldn't have cheese, yogurt, wine, or life-saving antibiotics. Food microbiology manages the safe transformation of our dairy and foods. And environmental microbiology goes even further. It studies the role of microbes in our water, air, and soil, and even extends out into space. Seriously, astrobiologists are searching for microbial life or understanding contamination on other planets and moons, like Mars. Finally, let's head into Section 6, the molecular frontier, decoding the blueprint. Now, what's really interesting about this setup is how we actually do this stuff today. In modern science, we don't just look at microbes under a microscope anymore. We rely heavily on tools like the PCR, or polymerase chain reaction machine. Tools like this PCR device allow scientists to take a tiny microscopic sample and amplify the RNA or DNA directly. This lets us sequence the genes to definitively identify what an organism is, exactly how it evolved, and how it behaves. It's an absolute game changer. This specific technology gave birth to an entirely new field called molecular epidemiology. Essentially, it's the science of studying genetic and environmental risk factors to really understand the etiology, distribution, and prevention of infectious diseases in human populations. So instead of just guessing where an outbreak came from, scientists can now look at the genetic variability within the pathogens themselves. They're literally tracking the evolutionary footprint of a disease as it moves from person to person across the globe. The real-world impact of PCR and molecular microbiology literally cannot be overstated. We use it to trace the exact source and origin of infections and track their transmission routes. We use it to identify the reservoirs, the animals or environments sustaining a disease. It is exactly how we find and monitor new emerging pathogens, like Ebola, or specific variants of concern in SARS-CoV-2, like Omicron. We use it to characterize dangerous drug-resistant bacteria like MRSA, and it's even used to definitively monitor the impact of large-scale public health efforts, like the incredibly important polio eradication programs in Nigeria. It's basically the ultimate tool for decoding the invisible world. Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen today that the microscopic world is vastly more complex and strange than our own. We've seen that things like viruses and prions, which entirely lack the basic components of cellular life, can fundamentally dictate the health and trajectory of our entire planet. So, if entities that aren't even fully alive hold that much power, what else is hiding in the invisible world, just waiting for us to develop the right lens to finally see it? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.